Hi, my name is Dr. Asta, and in today's anatomy class, I'm going to talk about axis and planes. So let's get started with it. So what are the different axes and planes that are there? And we'll first talk about what do you mean by planes and axis. So planes are the imaginary surface that is present in the body, and axis is the imaginary line. So plane is imaginary surface, whereas axis is imaginary line. Now in this imaginary line, through this imaginary line there's a movement happening. So if this is the imaginary line, then the movement happens around that line, that is axis. So now coming to planes, what are the different types of planes that are present? We have coronal plane, sagittal plane and transverse plane. What do you mean by coronal plane? If we are making a body like this, what we see from the anterior or the posterior part. So this diagram becomes this is the coronal plane. We can see the eyes, nose, mouth, neck, so this part, this is the coronal view. So this plane is coronal plane. Now coronal plane, since it is like this, okay, it divides the body into anterior half and posterior half. Okay, so coronal plane is this plane or the plane which cuts the body into anterior half and posterior, that is front half and back half. Okay, so that is the coronal plane. Now sagittal plane is the plane which comes in this way. Okay, if we are seeing something in this way or this part or this part, so when we make a diagram of a person which is coming like nose, mouth, and then we are making the diagram like this, so this becomes the sagittal plane. It's a plane which divides the body into right and left half. Now coming to the transverse plane. Transverse plane, with the name itself we can understand that it is this plane which divides the body into upper and lower half. Now coming to the axis. As we discussed already, axis is the imaginary line which is present in the body and around which the movement happens, and axis is present perpendicular to the plane. So we'll understand it later properly. And there are different types of axis: antero-posterior axis or sagittal axis. So what is sagittal axis? Sagittal axis, I've written antero-posterior along with it because it becomes much more easy to understand it. So sagittal axis is this axis. If I'm taking something from here, so this is the anterior and one end comes anteriorly and the other end goes posteriorly. So that means that is the sagittal axis. So it's antero-posterior axis. Now the other axis is also called as frontal axis. I also call it as transverse axis because it is present like this, from right to left, one end in the right and the other end in the left. So this is our transverse axis or frontal axis. Now the other axis is vertical axis. Vertical axis is coming from up, one end upwards and the other end downwards. So this axis is vertical axis. Now I hope we have understood the axis properly. Now it is very important to understand which movement occurs in which axis. So to make it more understandable and clear, I'm gonna do a small demo of a bottle and this screwdriver in order to explain how the axis, how the movement occurs in which axis. So if you have something like this, you can just use it. I've just made it by my own. I have made this as the anterior surface and this as the posterior surface. The cover which came, I just removed it from the posterior side and I just left it here. so that it becomes easy to understand which is anterior and which is posterior. and I just burned this and made hole in this. Show you how the axis goes inside. You can make something like this at your own home, so that you can understand the axis and the movement better. So let me start with the first one. Let's do the anteroposterior. This is like a bone for us. This is, for example, you can say that this axis is passing through the shoulder joint, and this bottle represents your humerus, your bone. So which movement is possible when the axis is coming from anterior to posterior? Is there rotational component? Can we do rotation? No. Can we do flexion extension on the anterior and posterior movement? That is also not possible. So the only movement possible is this and this. Do you remember which movement am I doing it here? Isn't it the same movement here? Abduction and adduction. Abduction and adduction. Therefore, the only movement available that can happen in anteroposterior or sagittal axis is, same theory works for every joint in our body. So anteroposterior axis causes what movement happens in that? Abduction and adduction. Abduction and adduction. So I hope it is very clear. Let's do the other axis, which is our frontal axis, which I call it as transverse axis. Now frontal axis is a transverse which is going from right to left or left to right. Now so here which movement is possible? Can we do rotation here? No. Can we do abduction, adduction here? No. Which is the only movement possible here? It is this. Okay. So which movement is this? Now see. Which movement is this? This is flexion and extension. So the only movement that is possible in transverse or frontal axis is flexion and extension. Flexion and extension. Other than that, you will not be able to do any other movements. So, and for every joint, for your elbow joint, consider this as the axis, consider this as your forearm. See, extension and flexion and extension. So now the other axis, I hope it's clear, the other axis remaining is vertical axis. Vertical axis means when the axis is moving from up to down or down to up. So here, if the axis is coming like this, can you do flexion extension over here? No, I mean this is because it's not properly fixed. You can't. Can we do abduction, adduction here? No. So the only movement which is possible here is your rotation. So all internal rotation, external rotation, all these movements occur in vertical axis. I hope now the concept of axis and movement is clear, and which movement is possible in which axis, that is also clear. There's nothing to mug up in this. Now talking about the planes where the movements are occurring, we will just do the same thing again. Let's do the antero-posterior one. Okay, so when we are doing antero-posterior axis, the movement happening is abduction and adduction. In which plane is this movement happening? It's happening in coronal plane, because this is this plane, right? So the movement is happening in this plane. That's why it is coronal plane or frontal plane. So abduction, adduction always happens in antero-posterior or sagittal axis and coronal plane. Now let's do the frontal axis or transverse axis. Okay, now here in transverse axis, the movement happening is this. That is your flexion and extension. Now which plane do you think it is? It is dividing the body into two halves, isn't it? So that's why this is this sagittal plane movement. This is a sagittal plane movement. Okay. So flexion and extension happens in frontal or transverse axis and sagittal plane. Now coming to the vertical, it came like this, and the movement possible over here is rotatory movement, rotation. And where does the rotation occur? In which plane does it occur? It occurs in which plane the movement is happening. If you keep your hand down and just see, can you see this? So this is the transverse plane. So the movement of rotation, external or internal rotation, it occurs in transverse plane and vertical axis. I hope that it's very clear to all of you. You can also, as I told you earlier, you can also use your hands just to make it out during exam or during viva or anytime whenever you need it. So you can just consider this as the segment of your bone, like I considered the bottle. Make sure that you first practice in the bottle and then only you come here, because it might be a little confusing. You keep place for axis, make this as the axis, one finger as an axis. So if I am taking transverse axis, which is this, so what is the movement? Can I do this movement here? No. The proper movement where the rotation happens around the axis is this, and this movement is nothing but flexion and extension. Okay, similarly you can also do, now take antero-posterior axis, which is like this. Again keep the segment here and see which movement. Can you do flexion extension here? No. So the rotatory movement that happens here is abduction and adduction. Similarly, if you are taking the vertical axis over here, can you do any other movement here? No. So the movement, you can't rotate, so the rotation has to happen in this direction. So that is our rotatory movement that occurs in vertical axis. I hope the video is very clear to you, and I hope the concept and the logic, everything you've taken from this video, and I really hope that you don't have to do any mugging up of which movement happens in which axis and plane anymore. With this I would like to end the video. Please do not forget to like my video and subscribe my channel, and do press the bell icon in order to get future notifications of my videos. Thank you.